Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Smoky Range Trailhead, which is accessible off of Canyon Creek Road. This location is in the Flathead National Forest in northwestern Montana, which is a hotbed for grizzly bear attacks. The geography here is forested mountains, which start at a high elevation, then climb to just under 7,200 feet at the top of Standard Peak. The trees here consist mostly of pine, fir, and spruce, but in the valleys, pockets of willow and buckbrush offer shade and shelter to animals. Berry bushes and other bushy plants create a hedge-like barrier for anyone trying to see through them in certain areas. Elk, moose, and white-tailed deer are common sights and are an attractive source of food for human hunters as well as animals who predate upon them. The dominant predators here include cougars, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, as well as black bears and grizzly bears. The small mountain town of Whitefish is under 10 miles from the Smoky Range Trailhead as the crow flies. This is close proximity to a grizzly bear that can cover that distance on a single afternoon while searching for food. Late summer is an interesting time for grizzly bears in this area. Summer's heat has stressed plants that the bears feed upon, and most berry seasons are in the last weeks of their yields. Food is getting harder to come by for bears, and the added stress of heat and dry conditions force them into cover and shade they would otherwise not search out during cooler, wetter times of the year. This stressor weighs heavier on younger and older bear populations, but particularly hard on sows with growing cubs. Not only do sows need to find enough food for their own survival during hibernation, they must also find enough to ensure the survival of the next generation of grizzly bears. On the afternoon of August 26, 2023, 2 archery hunters were scouting the Smoky Range Trailhead area ahead of their elk hunting trip. For privacy's sake, we'll refer to these hunters as Tim and Rick. Their hunting trip was likely planned during the elk rut, which occurs around the middle of each September. During this time, bull elk are vying for control of harems of cows. The winning bull will be more likely to breed the cows and pass on the strongest genes to the next generation of elk. While competing, bull elk sound a loud, high-pitched scream called a bugle, which echoes for miles through valleys. This is done to locate each other and attract more cows for breeding purposes. This vociferous method of communicating is used by hunters as well as predators to find the location of elk herds. Temperatures on this afternoon peaked at 83 degrees Fahrenheit, which is mild for this time of year. By mid-afternoon, moderate breezes had been blowing through the trees, causing any scent on them to be carried to or away from wary noses monitoring them. Tim and Rick had been scouting the area since early morning and were approaching a thick stand of vegetation. They planned to simply bushwhack their way through it and emerge at another spot with a better view from which to glass for elk. Unbeknownst to the hunters, a sow grizzly and her cub had taken up shelter amongst the cover there, likely dozing off while waiting out the heat of the day. As Tim pushed his way through the tangled brush, he encroached on a very deadly and dangerous boundary. The sow, hidden by the bushes as she and her cub lay in the shade, likely heard them once they were only a few yards from her. Eons of protective survival instinct triggered her to investigate such a close intrusion of her and her cub's location. Rick and Tim were only 15 feet from the sow grizzly by the time she made herself known to the hunters. She stormed from her resting place in what must have been a very terrifying surprise to the hunters. The men were only a few yards apart from one another, and Tim was slightly behind Rick when they realized the sow was already upon them. The hunters had undoubtedly considered a close proximity encounter with a grizzly, as they were armed on their scouting trip. The sources I could find did not indicate anything about the firearms they carried, but it is assumed that they carried pistols, as rifles would have been nearly useless in self-defense against a grizzly in brush at close range. No source I could find indicated that they had packed bear spray with them on their trip. As the angry sow quickly advanced toward the hunters, both of them drew their firearms and began to send hot lead her way. During the confusion and speed of the attack, the sow was struck by several rounds from each man. As Tim fired from behind and off to Rick's side, one of his bullets tore through his partner's shoulder. After the gunshots thundered and the sow fell, the grim tally was 1 dead grizzly bear and 1 wounded hunter. Rick's wounds were not lethal, but were serious. The bullet fired by his partner entered through the rear of his shoulder, rendering his arm limited in its use. During the raucous shooting, the cub had disappeared and likely sought refuge up a nearby tree or in a clump of brush. Tim and Rick immediately examined the wound in Rick's shoulder and tried to stop the bleeding as much as possible. They made their way out to their vehicle and got Rick to medical help for treatment of the wound. After being notified of the incident, the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks wardens began investigating the incident immediately. The sow's carcass was taken for analysis to gather information and confirm the hunter's account of the run-in with the sow and her cub. The grizzly killed during the attack was determined to be a 25-year-old female, which is very old for a sow with cubs. She had no history of conflict with people before this incident and was tagged in 2009 as part of a population survey on grizzlies in the area. Officials immediately began monitoring the location in search of the cub, but I could find no source pertaining to the failure or success of finding it. Depending on its age, the cub may have survived on its own. If it was a cub from the prior spring, it would likely die due to starvation or predation by a boar grizzly bear. After the investigation by the FWP's Wildlife Human Attack Response Team, the sow's behavior was deemed defensive due to the presence of her cub and the lack of conflict with people. Had she not been killed during the attack, she likely would have been left alone, even if she had mauled the hunters, due to the circumstances involved in the attack. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think this attack could have been avoided had the hunters found a route with better visibility? How did the hunters get so close to the grizzly and her cub without being detected? Would bear spray have prevented this attack? Do you think the cub found a way to survive? I hope so. I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Henry's Lake, Idaho, just 20 miles from the western border of Yellowstone National Park. The terrain here are high mountains interrupted by grassy meadows, with elevations between 6,500 and 8,000 feet high. The tall forests here are a combination of pine, fir, and spruce trees, mingled with stands of quaking aspen. Wild berries like serviceberry, thimbleberry, huckleberry, and golden currant fill in a dense undergrowth and provide shelter and food for animals and humans alike. The winters here are cold and snowy, with an average temperature of well below freezing, even during the daytime. Each month of winter averages about 3 inches of snowfall, which can add up to a foot or more near the end of the season. Given its proximity to Yellowstone National Park, you can expect to see moose, mule deer, elk, and pronghorn antelope browsing the meadow edges. The predators of this area include cougars, wolves, coyotes, black bears, and an increasing and spreading population of grizzly bears. Fall is a busy time for people in this area. Locals and visitors pack the mountains in search of game, beginning in late August with archery hunters, then rifle hunters at the beginning of October. Recreation is a key economic driver for communities here, as hunting, fishing, snowmobiling, and hiking draw visitors from around the world to this area. Fall is also a busy time for bears. Black bears and grizzlies are in hyperphagia, which is a metabolic state that increases their drive to find food. Bears will cover miles and miles each day looking for extra calories that will build their fat reserves needed for hibernation and may cause them to deviate from predictable patterns to do so. Just northwest of Henry's Lake is a small cluster of mountains called the Henry's Lake or Lion's Head Mountains, which are part of the Caribou-Targhee National Forest. There are many roads between this area and the national park, which conservationists say limit wildlife travel between ecosystems, but apparently grizzlies didn't get the memo. On the evening of September 30th, 2023, 2 elk hunters were sneaking through the timber in search of the elusive and secretive ungulates. For the sake of this episode, we'll refer to them as Mike and Steve, as their actual identities have not been released to the public. Mike and Steve have formulated a plan to stalk a stand of dark timber and determine the route each of them would plan to travel. They would make sure to be near each other, but far enough apart that elk would find it more difficult to circle around them in the timber. Elk that detect a human scent on the breeze will frequently tiptoe around them while using the breeze to their advantage, and can do this making very little detectable noise. I've had this happen to me many times while stalking elk in central Idaho. As Steve and Mike split up, they carried their hunting equipment as well as a sidearm, but did not pack bear spray. Mike headed along his planned route, and Steve was a little further around the hill and traveling a route that roughly paralleled Mike's. The plan was to meet up at the end of the stalk, or back at camp to discuss the information gathered during the stalk, if neither man was successful at getting a shot or harvesting an elk. As Steve sneaked through the shadows of the dark timber, he scanned each bush and tree for telltale signs of elk. An outline of an ear or the white fur on their rump are sometimes all the evidence the animals will provide as they secret themselves among the bushes. Knowing the habits of game animals is the key to successfully harvesting them. The hunters knew that in the evening the elk would be headed downhill to a water source to fill up after sleeping the day away in shaded beds higher on the mountains. While searching for a sign of elk in the area, Steve examined the trails for tracks and wallows for recent proof of their activity. He decided to continue on his route to the dark timber on the north side of the slope and began working his way toward that location. The brush on the northern slope of most mountains and hills here is more dense than on southern exposures due to longer-lasting accumulations of precipitation. Steve pushed his way through tangles of brush and over deadfall logs while keeping his eyes scanning for scant detail. As Steve crept along, a rustling in the bushes a short distance away caught his attention. He was probably hoping a nice-sized bull elk would emerge and present a broadside shot. But what blurred from the cover was a large sow grizzly, and she wasn't happy to find a human being so close to her, so unexpectedly. Now a little bit about grizzlies and their speed is in order to understand Steve's predicament. They can sprint at over 40 miles an hour, which translates into 44 feet per second. This distance is roughly equal to 15 yards, which means the sow emerging at only 100 feet would be upon Steve in about 2.5 seconds. That isn't much time to consider whether her charge is a bluff or a full-on attack. As soon as Steve's mind could process the bear's presence, he yelled out to Mike to make sure he knew the grizzly was close. That was all it took for the sow to initiate her attack on him. She began advancing toward him, as his hand was already reaching toward his pistol in its holster. The sources I could find regarding this incident did not indicate what caliber, make, or model of firearm Steve was carrying. I would only assume, by the outcome, that it had to be at least a .40 caliber, as a smaller firearm probably would have only injured the grizzly, increasing her aggression and not stopping her. Steve could see the grizzly stretching out her paws with each bound, bringing her dangerously close to him with each one. In a split second, he unholstered his pistol and let fly several shots, each striking the sow as she advanced toward him. By the time the gunshots stopped echoing down the valley, the sow had piled up only a few yards from Steve. He was shaken by the speed at which the sow closed the distance between them, but relieved that her progress was stopped by his focused and proficient use of his sidearm. Steve immediately knew that his elk hunt was over, at least for the time being. The hunters made their way back toward civilization to find a phone. They contacted the Idaho Citizens Against Poaching Group, which is an organization of Idaho citizens focused on preventing or apprehending wildlife poachers. CAP responders contacted the Idaho Fish and Game, who sent an investigative team to the attack site. They conducted a thorough investigation, utilizing the information provided by Steve as well as the forensic evidence, like bear and human tracks, shell casings, and entry wounds on the grizzly's carcass. They determined that the angle of the entry wounds verified Steve's portrayal of things, and decided that he had acted in self-defense. This is an interesting point, because they also indicated that the sow was acting in self-defense when reacting to the man's presence. During this incident, Mike and Steve were uninjured, and the sow grizzly was obviously killed. There was no source indicating that the sow was defending a cached food source, and didn't state that there were cubs present at the time. It appeared that the sow was simply reacting to a human being too close that apparently made her feel threatened. As a hunter, I go into the woods as prepared as I can for a confrontation with a hungry or aggressive predator. I think it is safe to assume that Mike and Steve did the same. If it weren't for Steve's quick reactions in defending himself, he may have been the victim of a bear attack. He may have sustained serious injuries or death at the paws, claws, and teeth of one of the world's most powerful predators. Authorities issued a statement encouraging hunters to carry bear spray, hunt in groups, watch for bear sign like tracks, scat, and digging. Hunters should remove their meat as fast as possible and hang it, as well as trash and food, at least 200 yards from their camp and at least 10 feet off the ground. They also advise that hunters make noise around creeks and streams, as the babbling of the water can drown out their approach. It seems like Steve and Mike followed these guidelines for the most part, which may have prevented a more serious and injurious attack. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think bear spray would have been effective to avoid this attack, or did it happen too fast? Do you think Steve should have waited to see if the grizzly sow was bluffing before firing his pistol? Why do you think Steve and the Grizzly ended up surprising each other? Was she napping when he approached? What would you have done if you found yourself in Steve's position and were being charged by an enormous grizzly from close range? I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Aspen Snowmass Ski Resort in Aspen, Colorado. This is the heart of the Rocky Mountains, and they are at their most majestic in this area. The granite peaks jet over 14,000 feet in elevation and push back the starry host on crisp fall nights. The tall forests of pine, fir, and spruce accommodate large patches of quaking aspen trees, which turn gold in autumn's jubilee. This patchwork of color and slope is the medium of Mother Nature at her most artistic. The elk, deer, and moose mosey through greenery and trim any plants like furry gardeners equipped with primitive tools. The predators here include stealthy cougars, comical coyotes, bodacious bobcats, and bedeviled black bear boars. On the evening of October 23, 2023, a security guard, whom we will refer to as Jack, was performing his perfunctory duties. On any given night, Jack may be called to confront loud hotel guests or escort unauthorized visitors from the St. Regis Aspen Resort. This job had its exciting moments, but for the most part was relatively easy. The luxury hotel had recently been closed for renovations and historically is a hub for the rich and famous frequenting the town of Aspen. It's positioned right at the base of the ski resort and draws visitors with finer tastes, with its kitchen serving delicious fare. Aspen is an interesting town nestled among the high ridge of Rocky Mountains about 100 miles west of Denver. Although the big city sprawls and bustles with towering buildings and honking horns, Aspen is quite the opposite. The mountains around the town rise inside the city limits and surround it like a crumpled emerald blanket. Unlike other blankets, this one may not bring warmth, safety, and rest, but unexpected visitors who do surprising and harmful things. On this evening, Jack was in the process of marking off his list of procedures that he performed each night. The quiet hotel was eerie and offered him the expectation of a boring and slow shift. Just after 11 p.m., Jack received a call over his radio regarding something very unusual. The static-filled voice over the radio mentioned something about a black bear being seen near the kitchen area of the restaurant. He probably thought the bear had just been seen peeking into a door and had left on its own. I imagine he thought it was a curious cub or a juvenile and could easily be driven off by a little yelling and clapping of his hands. Jack wasn't equipped with a firearm as a security officer, as his first response to a crisis would have been to call the police after investigating it himself. He wasn't equipped with bear spray, as he was working in a hotel and not a mountain meadow. As Jack warily walked toward the kitchen, he gripped the only self-defense tool he had access to, his radio. Now, if you know anything about bear attacks, the most important information is what the victim doesn't know. Jack wasn't aware that a rather large black bear, estimated to be at least 350 pounds, had been drawn to the courtyard of the hotel. The scent of food and garbage was released into the evening air by doors propped open during renovations, doors that would have normally been closed. Jack was unaware that this hungry black bear had found a way into the kitchen and had already begun wandering the hallways in search of food. Jack left the security room as soon as the bear's presence was reported. He carefully watched well ahead of him to see if he could locate the bear as he approached the kitchen. Taking the corners widely allowed him to see further down the hallways and into rooms as he examined the floor for muddy paw prints. Now, this bear attack was caught on video by the hotel's closed-circuit cameras. I've posted a link to this video on my Patreon account, which is linked below. If you'd like to check it out, it's pretty interesting and actually shows what is described below. Given it is the video of the attack, it wouldn't pass YouTube guidelines, so it wasn't included as part of this video. As Jack approached a hallway, he could see the footprints of a bear on the tile floor. The prints clearly went one way down the hall, then came back along the same path. The problem was figuring out if the bear was coming or going, and just where it had ended up. Jack proceeded from a prep room into a dishwashing room and glanced around. He didn't see the bear, and probably hoped he wouldn't see it. His eyes strained to search the shadows for a dark shape, but nothing materialized. Jack walked down a small hallway to enter another room, and just as he rounded a corner, he ran face to face with a short but very stout black bear. The light from the room behind Jack illuminated the face of the bear as it dashed toward him. As the bear quickly stood to its hind legs, Jack could see a beautiful hourglass-shaped patch of white fur in the middle of its chest. His mind processed mere fractions of a second like minutes. As he watched the right paw of the bruiser reach out toward him, Jack spun away to his left and back toward the door he came through. His mind may have been working faster than time passing, but his body was still bound by the laws of physics, matter, and energy, and there was simply no way he could escape the amount of energy the matter of the bear's paws was reaching out to impart upon him. As Jack spun to flee, the bear's massive right paw was heading toward him at a much faster and more powerful pace. The paw may have been intended for Jack's head, but where it struck him was along the right side of his back. In a blindingly quick swat, the black bear imparted enough force on Jack to send him flying over 10 feet across the kitchen floor, while completely tattering his suit jacket, shirt, and undershirt. The bear's claws cut through the flesh of Jack's back, leaving 5 distinct gashes, as well as a bear paw-shaped bruise. As Jack slid on his stomach across the kitchen floor, he clearly expected to receive follow-up bites, swats, and claw gashes. He lay prone and still for a split second, waiting to determine where he needed to defend from the bear's attack. In the CCTV footage, you can see the confusion and expectation of the bear on Jack's expression. The bear stood up on its hind legs while staring toward the human who had so suddenly materialized in front of him as he rounded the kitchen corner. Then the bear glanced back into the dark room behind it and disappeared into the safety of cover and distance. Once Jack realized the bear was not going to pounce on him to continue its attack, he pushed himself back to his feet and sprinted away from the kitchen area and that black bear that had so suddenly materialized in front of him as he rounded the kitchen corner. Jack immediately pressed the button on his radio and confirmed that there was definitely a large black bear in the kitchen area. The adrenaline of the blitzkrieg bear attack had dulled the pain from the gashes of the bear's claws. It was now starting to wear off a bit, and Jack knew he would need medical attention to help stave off infection. He used his cell phone to reach out for an ambulance to take him to medical help. I could find no summary of the medical assistance or number of sutures or stitches required to close Jack's wounds. The information indicated that Jack was released the next day after an overnight stay for observation in the hospital. Typical medical treatment after a bear attack is a heavy dose of antibiotics to fend off the infections, as well as stitches to close the layers of flesh penetrated by the bear's teeth and claws. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife Agency responded to the reports of Jack's run-in with the black bear just after it had occurred around 11 p.m. Monday night. They sent out a response team to the location, and while en route, the team observed 8 black bears walking the streets of Aspen, headed toward downtown. The response team arrived at the hotel just after midnight and immediately began scouring the area in search of the bear. They had a fairly unique description of the bear based on the hourglass-shaped patch of white fur on its chest. Its short but robust build also allowed the officers to eliminate other visiting black bears from their list of potential hotel kitchen invaders. Once they located the bear that fit the description, they were equipped and ready to tranquilize the bear. The problem with doing so in this location and time was that they were undermanned. They were concerned that they may lose the bear in the darkness and not be able to remove it. They decided to wait and return the next day to try again. On Tuesday evening, the officers returned to where they last saw the bear. This time, the game officers recruited the assistance of the Aspen Police Department, as well as the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office. The search party found the bear in Connor Park, near East Hopkins Avenue. After giving the bear the once-over to make sure he fit the description, they hazed the bear into a tree. A professionally aimed dart filled with tranquilizer put the bear to sleep, and it was recovered from the tree via a ladder on an Aspen fire truck just after 2 a.m. on Wednesday morning, October 25, 2023. Colorado Parks and Wildlife determined the bear to be a nuisance bear. Typically, bears in the area are allowed 2 strikes before being euthanized, but this bear's boldness and lack of fear of human beings in their dwellings was enough for them to decide to euthanize it. The large black bear was humanely put to sleep by CPW officers, and its carcass was taken for analysis. Following this incident, CPW issued a public warning encouraging residents to be bear aware. This statement is glaringly ironic given the incident occurred within a hotel kitchen, not a mountain trail. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Given there were 8 black bears observed by officials the same night they were responding to a bear attack inside a hotel, what do you think needs to happen to make Aspen streets safer from bear attacks? How do you think this bear attack could have been avoided? In what ways could it have been worse? Can you describe a face-to-face encounter with a hungry black bear at your job? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Beatty Gulch near Gardner, Montana. This area is a high wooded plateau that slopes up to the west, rising to over 7,500 feet in elevation. Beatty Gulch has pine, fir, and spruce trees scattered across a broad slope with a steep, brushy gully along the creek. Visibility is good in most places here, as the trees are far apart and the ground is covered with grass and sagebrush for the most part. Yellowstone National Park borders the gulch just a few hundred yards to the south. It is prime grizzly bear habitat that offers elk, white-tailed deer, and moose for prey. Other predators in this area include cougars, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, and black bears. Many of Montana's residents are frequent hunters, and accessing the border around Yellowstone National Park is a key place to find animals. Deer, moose, and elk leave the safety and security of the park and wander in search of mates or food across its boundaries and into adjoining hunting units. This allows hunters who are aware of the park boundaries the opportunity to harvest game animals and fill their freezers with delicious elk, moose, and deer meat. Wildlife agencies indicate that there are 2,100 grizzly bears in western Montana, with the majority of those bears living in or near Glacier National Park in the northwest portion of the state. This leaves around 1,000 grizzlies broadly distributed over the rest of the state. Population densities of grizzly bears here average 1 bear for every 25 square miles. This may not seem very high, but given the amount of room and resources grizzlies require for their existence, the bears are in a state of overpopulation in ecosystems that support them. Grizzlies in this area used to have an abundant source of fat and nutrients delivered to any body of water in their habitat. Seasonal salmon runs would provide valued nourishment to the entire ecosystem and help the bears grow fat for hibernation. In the late 1940s, the construction of dams, the presence of pollution, and overfishing caused seasonal salmon runs to stop altogether. Since the 1980s, salmon reintroduction efforts have been met with a limited amount of success, but may never be restored to their previous levels, which supported bear populations. The absence of salmon has forced bears to find alternate sources of calories, which they defend aggressively from any intruder. On Tuesday, September 26, 2023, a hunter whom we will call Nick was pursuing game in Beatty Gulch. Game animals are plentiful here, and sign of their presence covers the landscape as they move to find food and mates. Nick was aware that grizzlies were in the area in which he was hunting. He continually searched for signs of bear activity, such as scat or torn-up stumps. He had no way of anticipating the frightening and dangerous events that would unfold on this fateful day. As Nick hiked along the relatively clear slope of the gulch, he kept his eyes up and scanned for the flick of an ear or the telltale yellow and white patch on their rumps. He eagerly hoped for a nice trophy animal with a big body to materialize before his eyes. They are like ghosts here and can appear and disappear seemingly at whim, and finding them is frequently a pleasant surprise. Just as Nick rounded a small rise in the slope of the gulch, a large brown mass appeared just a short distance away. At first glance, it appeared to be a stump from a long-dead tree, but then it moved. Right before Nick's eyes, the stump grew a large head, revealing the distinct profile of a grizzly bear. Its dish-shaped face and huge hump of muscle on its shoulders proved to be the most ominous signs of the one animal Nick did not want to run into during his hunt. As soon as the bear lifted its head, it looked right at Nick. The bear immediately began charging toward the hunter. Nick's heart sank as he knew this was no bluff charge. He could see a large mound of sticks and dirt scraped up behind the bear as it bore down on him. He knew he had to act quickly to keep himself from harm and possibly save his own life. Nick yelled at the bear and quickly raised his hunting rifle to his shoulder. He prepared for the worst and clicked off the safety. The bear was closing in on him from less than 50 yards, and he didn't have a lot of time to react. As he watched the bear flowing toward him, he could see its fur bounce with each bound and muscles ripple as they absorbed the energy of each stride. Its head was high and steady as its eyes fixed on Nick's face. By the time the bear closed to within 20 yards, Nick had decided to fire his hunting rifle. He tried to time the pull of the trigger of his hunting rifle with a gentle bouncing of the grizzly's head. Once the sights of his rifle and the bear's head lined up, he pulled the trigger. His body jerked as the rifle roared in reaction to the man's will. The bullet tore its path like a destructive affliction and smashed its way through the bear's skull. As soon as the energy of the bullet overwhelmed the protective structure of the bear's skull, Nick watched the bear's head drop toward the ground. The bear's body tumbled and then skidded to a stop only a few yards from Nick's feet. Nick knew that he had narrowly avoided being maimed by the bear, and that he had to get a hold of authorities to report the details of the incident. They would want to know the circumstances surrounding the bear's death, and would expect his cooperation to fully understand the contributing factors of this incident. The only scars Nick would take away from this run-in with the grizzly would be the nagging questions of alternate outcomes that would wake him up on restless nights. This grizzly was one of 3 bears killed by sportsmen while defending themselves in the outdoors in the month of September in Montana, 2023. This trend is one of the most alarming and concerning issues faced by states that make up grizzly territory. After a thorough investigation, authorities concluded that the portrayal of events presented by Nick was supported by the forensic evidence collected at the attack scene. They also confirmed that the bear was defending a food cache containing an animal it had stashed for consumption. The grizzly was merely acting in defense of a valued and needed resource for its survival, even though the outcome could easily have been profoundly harmful and damaging to Nick's life and health. The evidence showed that there were no cubs observed at the scene, nor was there evidence of them being in the area. There was no cub tracks or orphaned grizzly cubs located in subsequent weeks. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think bear spray may have changed the outcome of this attack? What more could Nick have done to avoid the conflict with this grizzly? Was this bear looking to make a meal out of Nick, or was it simply defending its food cache? What would you do if you were surprised by a charging grizzly in open country? I'll be glad to read your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. I enjoy seeing where our viewers are from, so I would like to invite you to post the flag of your nation, state, or province in the comments section of this video. Today's episode takes us to the small town of Island Park, Idaho. The geography of this area is rolling hills covered in dense stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, split by undulating waves of grasses and sagebrush. The elevation here is over 7,000 feet, and the winters are extremely cold with frequent accumulations of snow. The summers are nearly always hot and dry, creating a season of feast and famine for all animals in the area. There are plenty of berry bushes here, and along any given body of water you will see dense pockets of willow. Yellowstone National Park is only a stone's throw away, so there's always a constant ebbing and flowing of moose, deer, and elk based on seasonal demand. The predators of this area are a murderer's row of deadly and cunning carnivores. Wolves, cougars, coyotes, and bobcats, along with black bears, are seen regularly, but the most dangerous of predators, the grizzlies, are much more elusive and stealthy than the others. Island Park is located near Henry's Fork, which is a tributary of the Snake River. It is a world-class fly fishing destination for the beautiful rainbow trout that populate the streams here. The Continental Divide is a few miles north of the town and divides the waters flowing west into the Columbia River system and the east flowing into the Mississippi River system. This very rugged and remote area is a hotbed of grizzly and human conflicts, which are beginning to come to a head. In the early morning hours of Thursday, September 23, 2021, 2 archery hunters, whom we will call Tom and Don, were pursuing elk near Stamp Meadows. The heavily timbered hills give way to broad meadows of grass, on which bull elk strut to put on a show to attract cows who are ready to breed. Elk are grazers, which means they eat grass, as opposed to being browsers like deer and moose. Browsers dine on the shoots, leaves, and stems of various bushes and trees. The growth of grasses in Stamp Meadows make it a prime habitat for elk during a time of year that is demanding for them. As Tom and Don stalked their way along the edge of the meadow, they kept a wary eye out for grizzly bear sign. Tracks are far too common in this area, so seeing them isn't necessarily proof of a grizzly being in the immediate area. Given the bear's tendency to travel many miles in a given day, once you see a track, even if it's fresh, it isn't always correct to assume the grizzly is still nearby. Other forms of evidence of grizzly bear activity, like seeing stumps torn apart or anthills that have been dug up along with the grizzly bear tracks nearby, are a harbinger that grizzlies regularly seek food in this area. When they find a reliable location for food, grizzlies are known to frequently return on a regular pattern in search of more. As the archery hunters paralleled the tree line, they unknowingly walked within several yards of a hungry and very territorial sow grizzly bear, who took defending her cubs from any perceived threat very seriously. Don was armed with a 10mm semi-automatic pistol, and Tom carried a primed can of bear spray for protection. As the hunters encroached on the sow's hiding spot, which was a thick stand of low-growing jack pines, she sprang upon the men in a lightning-quick ambush. The sow emerged from cover only a few yards from the hunters and quickly closed the short distance in what seemed like an instant. Even though both men were completely surprised by the ambush, the knowledge of being in grizzly bear territory had them mentally prepared to defend themselves. Don immediately reached his hand toward his pistol, while Tom wrapped his hands around his bear spray canister. By the time the sow had approached to within 10 yards, Don began firing his pistol. As he heard his partner's shots ring out, Tom flicked the safety cap from the top of his bear spray canister and let loose that hellish orange cloud of billowing burning. As the sow was impacted by the bullets of Don's pistol, she was likely momentarily confused by the presence of two targets. The fact that bear spray was correctly dispensed didn't help her cause, as the noxious cloud began to irritate her eyes and nose. Her lungs filled with the burning concoction, and her breathing was replaced with coughs and gagging. Had the temperatures been lower, the propellant qualities of the bear spray canister would likely have rendered the irritant non-functional and ineffective. Don's accuracy must have been lethal, because the bullets fired from his pistol took their toll on the sow. After having several 10mm-sized holes punched through vital areas of her anatomy, the sow breathed her last and gave up her grizzly ghost. As the pistol shots stopped echoing through the valley, Don and Tom could see two grizzly bear cubs scampering through the brush. Now without their mother and sole protector, they did the only thing they knew to do, and bolted for cover. The cubs' mother had taught them well in her brief time with them, but now, without her, their future would be bleak, if not unsustainable. Tom and Don knew that the events that had transpired would be analyzed, critiqued, and questioned by well-intending state and federal investigators. It was a good thing for the archery hunters that the terrain in this area was rolling as opposed to being steep. This allowed them to reach out to game wardens via their cell phones and request that they hear the details of the run-in with the sow and her cubs. Wardens from the Idaho Fish and Game arrived on the scene around 8:30 a.m., immediately followed by federal wardens. Tom and Don explained the details of the incident and made sure to pass on that the sow's two cubs were still out there. During their investigation of the archery hunters' claims pertaining to the attack, federal and state agencies clearly acknowledged that this grizzly sow was killed in self-defense. They also initiated a broad and comprehensive search for the orphaned cubs. The fact that the government wardens initiated a search is proof that the cubs must have been born this past spring. If they were from the prior spring, it would have been assumed that they may have been able to make it through the winter on their own, and likely too wary of humans to be easily caught. If they were found before a boar grizz found them, they could be safely captured and transported to the Island Park Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center. Orphan grizzly cubs are raised in safe and secure enclosures at this facility and serve as a real-life example for visitors to learn about grizzlies. Although the search didn't find the cubs, the investigation found that Don and Tom did not violate any state or national laws. They were found to have acted solely in self-defense and were not charged with any crimes, nor were they cited for any violations. Tom and Don's grizzly attack is not the only incident in Stamps Meadows between grizzlies and humans in recent years. On July 9, 2021, a trail runner from Maryland was jogging when he ran into a sow and her cub. She knocked him to the ground and bit him several times before dashing back into the brush with her cub. The runner sought and received medical help from Madison Memorial Hospital in nearby Rexburg, Idaho. Later that same month, a man was mountain biking past Stamp Meadows. As he sped down the trail, a sow grizzly and her cub charged at him as he passed a clump of brush. Fortunately, he was going too fast for the bears to catch up with him, and he got away without an injury. As a follow-up to the previously mentioned confrontations, on the evening of September 1, 2023, two archery hunters were sneaking through the dense brush just west of Island Park Reservoir. Both of the bow hunters were armed with pistols and managed to pull them out before a giant grizzly boar could close the distance between them. They fired several shots into the massive mauler and introduced him to his angels before he could harm either of them. They called into the Fremont County Dispatch to file a report relaying the facts surrounding their altercation with the big and angry grizz. Following the thorough investigation, the archery hunters were found to have acted in self-defense and were not charged with any infractions. If you remember a few episodes prior to this one, I mentioned that both of my teenage sons drew bull moose tags in the hunting unit that includes Island Park. I commented on how we'd seen no moose, bulls or cows, in over 3 weeks of hunting in 3 different months. We did, however, see a multitude of grizzly bear tracks, and even followed a grizzly bear from an uncomfortable distance of only 150 yards for over 20 minutes. I mention this because it is apparent through my own experiences in this area that not only are the grizzlies here aggressive toward people, but they're currently overburdening their habitat's carrying capacity. When a visitor can find grizzly bears roaming between 2 highways in broad daylight, the way my sons and I did, then they are clearly being mismanaged. This trend line can only lead to more attacks and deaths on both sides of each species. After reviewing the short list of incidents involving hostile grizzlies and human beings, it is clear that the aggressive grizzly bears near Island Park, Idaho, take exception to the presence of people being near their cubs, food caches, and their territory more than any other grizzly population in the world. What could possibly be making this population of grizzlies so defensive or offensive to human presence? After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think there is an environmental factor that causes grizzlies around Island Park to be more hostile toward the presence of humans? If salmon migrations were reestablished, would this reduce human and grizzly confrontations? Is the lack of management, including hunting seasons or hazing seasons, creating an untenable and dangerous situation around Island Park, Idaho? Would you consider it worth the risk to catch a giant rainbow trout in the Henry's Fork and possibly be attacked by a grizzly who didn't appreciate your penchant for fly fishing? I will enjoy reading and responding to your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to a familiar place on this channel and too close to home for me personally. We're discussing a grizzly attack which happened near Sawtell Peak, just north of Island Park, Idaho. The Montana border is a stone's throw away, since it is the watershed on the next hill to the west. When you think of high country, pictures of this kind of area may come to mind, given its elevation is between 7,000 and 8,000 feet, depending on where you're located on the mountain. At the foot of Sawtell Peak lies uninterrupted miles of pine, fir, and spruce tree forest, and through it winds the Henry's Fork of the Snake River and the world-class trout fly fishing it offers. Common animals here include moose, elk, and mule deer. The predators here include bobcat, black bear, coyotes, cougars, and wolves, but the ever-increasing grizzly bear population is what is the focus of our discussion today. About 15 miles east is the boundary of Yellowstone National Park, and given nothing but mountains and forest lay between here and there, it isn't difficult to imagine grizzlies wandering out of the park in search of food or their own territory to claim. In fact, the year of 2015 had been a bumper crop for bear complaints. The Fremont County Sheriff's Office had fielded numerous calls from concerned citizens reporting grizzly sightings throughout the summer. The Idaho Fish and Game had to work in conjunction with federal agents to put down a 25-year-old male grizzly who had been breaking into outbuildings around Island Park recently. They said that judging by his age and appearance, he was no longer able to forage for his typical fare. He was led into human areas by competition over prime areas and by starvation. By fall time, archery season rolls around and elk and deer hunters dust off their camouflage and bows to sneak through the woods to try to bag some meat for the winter. To be successful at archery hunting, you not only have to be stealthy, you also have to move silently, or at least quietly, if you want to stay undetected by wary prey animals, and even then it isn't guaranteed. The senses of hearing and smell of deer and elk have adeptly detected predators before they can present any danger to their lives for untold eons. The success of the species is proof of that theory. In the early morning hours of Monday, August 31st, 2015, 55-year-old Mike Adams was putting the sneak on some elk on the slopes of Sawtell Peak. The prior days had brought a heavy rain, and the creek nearby was loudly babbling, drowning out any other noises. Mike was an avid bow hunter and lived in Idaho Falls, a few hours south along the freeway. In years when Labor Day falls toward the end of the first week of September, Idaho bow hunters can enjoy an opening day weekend without the holiday crowds, and this is exactly what Mike was doing.
Given his relatively remote location, he likely had the entire mountain all to himself, minus whatever other archery hunters who may have been around. Now Mike was no greenhorn, nor was he unaware of the possibility of running into the area's grizzly bears. He was left-handed, so he placed his bear spray holster on his left hip and his .44 Magnum pistol on his right one. As he quietly slipped through the shadows of the dark timber, there is no way Mike could have known that he was getting danger close to a deer carcass that a hungry mama grizzly had cached and was now protecting with every bit of the power and fury her species is known for. A sudden snap drew Mike's attention away from scanning the timber for the elk he was trailing. As he swung his head in the direction of the snap, his vision was filled with the terrifying sight of a massive sow grizzly closing in on him from his left and only a few yards away. His heart sank in his chest even further when he saw her 3 cubs trailing not far behind. Before Mike had so much as let out a grunt, the sow had latched her powerful jaws onto his left forearm. The impact of her attack had knocked him around, and he couldn't reach his bear spray across his body with his free right hand. The only thing he could do was reach for his pistol. As the angry sow jostled Mike around and tore into his flesh on his forearm, he attempted to pull his pistol from his hip holster. He could feel the immense pressure of her jaws on his bones, and her 2-inch teeth painfully tore nickel-sized holes through his flesh. Each time she bit, she pulled him toward her and tossed her head, which took him off balance. Then she would bite into his forearm in a different place. Each time he grabbed for his pistol, she would jerk him around, making his attempts at gripping his pistol impossible. After several seconds, Mike was able to grasp the pistol grip of his .44 Magnum, and from point-blank range fired off several shots in quick succession. The sow and her cubs scampered through the brush in a scattered retreat, frightened away by the repeated roar of the pistol. For a few seconds after watching the sow and her cubs flee, Mike was stunned and tried to collect himself. He was certain at least a few of his rounds had hit the sow, especially given she was biting on his other arm. His forearm was bleeding and painful, but the bear only managed to bite him there, though she had done so several times. She had missed swatting him with her paws, otherwise his injuries would have been much more severe, if not fatal. Mike was by himself when he set out, and knew there was no one nearby to call on for help. He did have one possible way to reach out, though, and he used his right hand to retrieve his cell phone from his pocket. Mike pressed the button on it and checked the service bars to see if he would get enough reception to complete a call to 911, and then dialed. The emergency response system had recently included a remarkable update to its services. They used his cell signal to pinpoint his location on a map and guided him through several miles of the Caribou-Targhee National Forest on a direct path to an ambulance at a nearby road. The waiting medics got to work bandaging Mike's wounds to slow the bleeding and loaded him aboard. They sped toward the Madison Memorial Hospital in Rexburg, Idaho, about 50 miles to the south as the crow flies. Once Mike arrived there, the staff cleaned his wounds and wheeled him into the X-ray station, where they examined the bones of his forearm. Fortunately for Mike, none of his arm bones were broken, and his wounds were closed with sutures and bandaged. Mike's wounds were noted to be several bites on his left forearm and tears in some of the muscle and skin from the sow tossing her head after she bit him. His left hand was also chewed up pretty good, but after receiving treatment, Mike was released to heal at home. Following Mike's attack, investigators made the trip to the GPS location of his attack. They really needed to know if they had a wounded grizzly on their hands, and would have to dispatch her, and possibly her cubs, if they determined she'd been wounded. Upon arriving at the attack site, they found Mike's hat that had been shaken from his head during the attack. They also found the cached deer carcass and the sow's tracks as she attacked Mike. The area was scoured for 6 hours while they searched for any evidence that the bullets fired from Mike's .44 Magnum had struck the sow or one of her cubs. The size of the pistol would make a hell of a wound, so there should be fur and blood spatter on the ground, but they found none. After determining Mike's shots had somehow missed striking the grizzly entirely, they determined she was likely not wounded. Given her attack was centered around defending a cached deer carcass, as well as protecting her 3 cubs, they deemed her attack a defensive one. They decided to take no action against the sow, given her actions or reactions were expected grizzly bear behavior given the circumstances. Mike eventually made a full recovery, but I could find no source indicating if he had ever returned to archery hunting. He was not charged with any violation resulting from the investigation of his attack. The 19,000 square mile area around Yellowstone National Park is said to host 757 grizzly bears, which are still listed as endangered. Many residents and some scientists state that the area is above maximum carrying capacity for grizzly bears, and that they are now spreading into areas of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming that they've not been for decades. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. How do you think it's possible that Mike missed the bear with every single shot he fired from point-blank range? Do you think you would stand a chance of hitting the grizzly while shooting from that range? Is archery hunting in grizzly territory a risk you'd be willing to take? As prepared as Mike was for a run-in with a bear, what more could he have done to prevent or avoid it? The next time you're sneaking through the woods and you hear a twig snap, will the story of Mike's grizzly bear attack come back to your mind? I'll be glad to read your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Gravelly Range in the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest in southwest Montana. The Gravellys, as locals refer to them, are a remote and isolated geographic area with very little road access. It is the largest expanse of natural prairie in Montana that is undisturbed. The elevation here varies from 7,400 to 9,500 feet and showcases subalpine grasslands and conifer forests rolling like great waves of green. Many people make the trip to this area to hike and view the numerous wildflowers that bloom from June through July each year. Over 250 species of plants call this area home, along with elk, deer, moose, and pronghorn antelope. The predators in the Gravellys include coyotes, wolves, cougars, bobcats, and black bears, as well as a growing population of grizzly bears. In late fall, food sources for grizzly bears begin to decrease in quality and amount. They have spent the spring and summer browsing succulent greens and devouring delicious berries, amassing needed fat for hibernation, and all that effort culminates in a peaceful retreat into a den for the winter. When the grogginess of torpor begins to set in, grizzlies will begin to search for an ideal place to excavate themselves a den on the upper one-third of 30 to 60-degree slopes on the north face of mountains. Researchers indicate that they prefer to make their dens at elevations between 6,000 and 10,000 feet, but the reasons are not clearly explained. After 3 to 7 days of digging, their den will be finished. The bears will spend up to 6 months in a state of torpor, in which their bodily functions slow down while they rest. They can wake up easily if they do not manage to store enough body fat. On Saturday, October 21st, 2023, a hunter, whom we will call Tom, was hiking the meadow edges and glassing for game. There are several game animals in season at this time of year in Montana, and Tom could take any animal for which he had a tag. The sign of animals in the area is a constant sight here because there are so many. You can hardly walk 30 yards before coming across a deer track or an elk track. Grizzly tracks, on the other hand, are fewer and far between, and a definite precursor that should keep your head on a swivel for their presence. Unbeknownst to Tom, one of the area's giant sow grizzlies was just around the bend from his location. She had spent the summer eating as much food as she could in the valleys and had made her way up to the high country to find a good place to hibernate. The northern slope of the mountain she picked was a prime location with soil that allowed her to dig a nice deep den. Because it was the northern exposure of the mountain, it was thick with trees and bushes which would act as insulation while she waited the winter out. She used her massive paws, tipped with long, sharp claws, to pull the human equivalent of a shovel of dirt out of her denning spot with each rake of her paws. This bear had had a great year in terms of food and was in prime condition. She was what humans would consider a good bear, in that she had never had any conflicts with people or their dwellings, sticking to herself and leaving the people and their animals alone. As Tom hiked through the trees, scanning for movement, the bear continued to dig her den. The most dangerous part about a bear digging a den is that once the den gets deep enough for them to crawl halfway into, they are nearly invisible to anyone passing by. With their heads buried deep in their den, they can't hear, see, or smell anyone approaching them in time to give themselves a chance to escape. This combination of time of year, denning needs, and human recreation was just about to culminate in a horrible and terrifying event that both parties would probably rather avoid. Pushing his way through the brush, Tom's path must have taken him right next to the opening of the grizzly's den. By the time he heard her woof at him, he knew he was way too close for comfort. He glanced up and could see the bear's powerful paws crashing their way through the undergrowth and closing the few yards that separated them. He knew that it would be a horrible gamble to lose betting the bear was bluffing as she charged toward him. He had less than a few seconds to decide what to do and do it, or potentially lose his life. Tom raised his hunting rifle to his shoulder and fired when the bear was scant feet from him. His bullet hit the off switch on the bear's life as she piled up and laid still. The inanimation of death is a sad thing, and to witness it in an animal you didn't intend to kill can be heart-rending. Most hunters have no desire to shoot or injure an animal they do not get to keep and consume, and I think it is safe to say that Tom must have felt the same sentiments. As the surprised bear lay dead, Tom knew he had to get a hold of the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks authorities so they could understand what had transpired. He quickly made his way back down the mountain to his vehicle, and as soon as he was in range, he contacted them with the details of the incident. The authorities sent a response team to the location at which they could find the bear's body, according to Tom. They traveled to the scene of the incident and examined the grizzly's remains. The forensic evidence told the story very clearly. They could see the bear's tracks at the den site indelibly pressed into the loose soil she had pulled from the inside of it. Following her tracks as she bounded toward Tom confirmed his story of self-defense. They decided his defense of his life was a valid reason for killing the grizzly. They notified him that he would not be cited for any violations. In an initial analysis, the United States Fish and Wildlife Agency is still completing its investigation of the attack, and results have yet to be made publicly available. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. How do you think Tom could have possibly avoided this confrontation with the grizzly? Do you think Tom was making noise, and that brought the sow out of her den? How difficult is it to spot a grizzly who is at least partially concealed in a den she is digging? Do you think bear spray may have prevented this attack and possibly saved the bear's life? How could this encounter have been worse than it was? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to the Park Highway in Denali National Park, Alaska. This stretch of road winds its way from Denali Park headquarters through the heart of the park with many stunning and majestic overlooks on the beautiful terrain. The geography here is steep mountain slopes topped with snowfall nearly year-round, with valleys filled with alder, willow, and a few scattered stands of birch, aspen, and spruce trees. The Park Highway allows park visitors an immersive experience in the wilds of the park. From this highway, visitors can hike trails and climb to vantage points to see moose, caribou, and Dall sheep. The predators of the park include coyotes, wolves, lynx, black bears, as well as grizzly bears. Near mile marker 7 is a steep mountainside on the north side of the highway. On September 11, 1973, a man by the name of Alfred Johnson was out taking pictures for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Now, the source I have for this attack doesn't indicate Alfred's age, but I think it is safe to assume he was a young pup because an older man would know better than to do what he did. While Alfred hiked the pictorial peaks and sublime slopes, popping pictures of postcards unseen, something caught his attention. On the hill above him he noticed not one or two, but 4 grizzly bears grazing their way across a clearing only 100 yards away from him. He was excited that none of the bears had noticed him being so close. It was apparently a sow with 3 larger cubs from the year prior. Spotting a spruce tree not too far from the bears, Alfred decided to do something that was apparently entertaining to him. He sneaked around the bears and climbed a tree. Then he began making sounds like a rabbit in distress to see what the bears' reactions would be. Now, a little bit of information about spruce trees is in order to understand Alfred's predicament. Spruce trees can be fairly large, but in this location don't get very tall compared to their southern counterparts. Their growth season is brief, so they are shorter overall. They also have branches very low to the ground, which acts as an insulative barrier during winter, but it also makes them easy to climb, even for grizzlies. Alfred watched the 4 grizzlies from his apparently safe perch high in the tree, but could see the sow ignoring his attempts to get her attention. He was under the impression that grizzlies couldn't climb trees, and his shenanigans couldn't possibly get him into any hot water. He decided to keep it up, but she simply didn't buy the idea that there was a wounded rabbit near her. Alfred decided to continue his dying rabbit act until the sow suddenly raised her head and glared in his direction. She quickly blurred toward the tree he was precariously perched in. Once the sow got to the trunk of the tree, she looked up at the man for a few seconds, then stood to her hind legs. The sow reached her paw up into the tree and stepped one of her hind legs onto a lower branch, just like Alfred did to climb the tree. To Alfred's surprise, this sow climbed the spruce tree in pursuit of the source of that annoying sound. The sow somewhat clumsily climbed the spruce tree high enough that she could reach his left foot. Alfred was not only surprised that he ran into the first grizzly bear to ever climb a tree, but he was also terrified at the fact that she was close enough to clamp her jaws onto his ankle. This spruce tree now had the weight of a man and a very large grizzly bear precariously perched on its branches. I cannot find a source on the internet that tells me how much weight a medium-sized spruce tree can support, but I am pretty sure that the two of them were stressing those limits. As the grizzly reached the height of Alfred's ankle, she sank her giant canines into his flesh and punched right through his pants, socks, and tissues. Pain shot through Alfred's body as the consequence of bringing a foolish idea into reality hit him. Once she latched her jaws onto his ankle, she used her immense weight to pull him from the spruce tree by relaxing her own grip on the tree. The enormous force of the weight of the sow quickly overwhelmed Alfred's grip on the tree, and the universal force of gravity took over from there. As Alfred tumbled toward the ground, bouncing off of spruce boughs, I wonder what went through his mind. He must have been regretting coming up with such a foolish idea. I imagine at some point he thought he should have listened more to his mother when she instructed him not to tease animals. Alfred and the sow came crashing to the ground at the base of the spruce tree in a heap. He was dazed and disoriented, but the sow didn't waste any time in taking out her anger on that source of chronic irritation to her and her cubs. Alfred lifted his hands to block her swats as she slashed him about the head with her claws, tearing his scalp severely. The sow didn't spare his neck and arms either. She slashed and bit him from hand to hand and back up his neck just to make sure he got the point of each of her teeth. As we have discussed before in prior episodes, when bears bite into flesh, they pull, which tears wound cavities deep in the tissues. These cavities fill with blood and cause painful bruising despite not breaking the skin. It is also these wound cavities that, if punctured by the canine teeth, can host serious and even deadly infections. By the time the grizzly was done taking out her frustration on Alfred, he had suffered puncture wounds from her teeth and gashes from her claws over his head, neck, and both arms. He was a painful and bloody mess as a result of angering this protective mama bear. When she had decided Alfred had had enough, she slowly meandered back in the direction of her cubs to make sure they were okay. As soon as the coast was clear, Alfred slowly worked his way back to his feet. He probably wasn't as dizzy from blood loss as much as he was from the violence and speed of the sow's attack. He tried to assess his injuries, but they were simply too many to examine while in the presence of an angry grizzly. His blood had soaked his clothes, but he was able to hike the 1/2 mile back to the highway, where he had parked his vehicle. There is no source indicating how many stitches or sutures it took to close his wounds, but I am sure each painful stitch was etched in his memory. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think it is wise to make sure you don't make any noise that sounds like a prey animal while you are in bear country? Was it the sound of a dying rabbit that brought the sow to his tree, or was she irritated by him? What lessons do you think the cubs observed or learned by watching Alfred being mauled? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Igloo Mountain, which lies just west of Denali National Park in Alaska. This mountain is a large rock dome with brushy and wooded hillsides sloping to thick riparian zones along the water's edge. Visibility is limited at human height, which is probably why animals here smell scents from far away. This area is located north of 61 degrees latitude, which means that plant life here competes for rare resources. On the northern slopes of mountains, the trees tend to be shorter as the daylight they receive is limited. The south-facing mountains have more exposure, so the tendency of plant life to grow taller and bushier helps them gather more energy from the sun. Alaska birch, black cottonwood, black spruce, and aspen trees are the most common trees with a myriad of grasses and bushes growing in between. These plant resources provide food to animals like caribou, moose, muskox, and sheep, which in turn are food for predators like wolves and grizzly bears. At 3:50 p.m. on August 4, 1961, Napier Shelton was increment boring on a spruce tree on Igloo Mountain. He was an ecologist and a graduate of Duke University. The increment boring process entails the use of a small mechanical auger that cuts free a core of wood the size of a pencil from a tree. The wood core is then analyzed by scientists to gather information about tree populations in the area. Napier was tasked with finding certain species of trees and pulling these cores from the trees. As he went from tree to tree, he would carefully take a brief moment to examine the tree, then lay out his boring equipment before beginning to use the auger. This entire process can take 10 to 20 minutes for each sample, and one by one, they are placed in the collection from each forest sampled. As Napier approached his next and last tree, he laid out his auger and other tools as he examined the tree. This tree was about 25 feet tall and was 14 inches across its trunk. It was a somewhat peculiar tree as it grew at nearly a 90-degree angle from the surface of the mountain. Its limbs grew to the base of the tree and were close together, almost like ladder rungs. He placed the cutting bit against the bark of the tree and began twisting the handle on the auger. After a few moments of effort, the auger sank into the tree and the sample wood began to fill the core cavity. Napier couldn't have known that he was very near a grizzly bear, but perhaps the bear knew he was close to Napier. It isn't clear if the bear smelled his scent on the breeze or stumbled into Napier, but it is clear it didn't like him being nearby. As Napier worked with his auger, a loud woof sound startled him. It was a bear, and it was very close to him. His first instinct was to freeze, but he knew he would have to see the bear to check what it was doing. Napier quickly turned his head and could see a huge grizzly closing in on him fast. He could see its muscles ripple with energy with each leap it made toward him. He knew he wouldn't have much time and the bear would be on him. Napier couldn't afford to see if the bear was bluffing or bent on attacking him, so he reached up and grabbed the lowest branch of the tree from which he was taking the core sample. As the bear closed in on him, Napier managed to get several feet off the ground. With each limb he pulled himself past, the more certain he was that he was going to be safe. Napier climbed to a point and then wrapped his arms around the tree. As he glanced down to the ground, he had hoped to see a grizzly bear frustrated at his escape or perhaps turning around and leaving. Instead, to his horror, he saw the massive grizzly using the exact limbs he used to pull himself into the tree, to do the same but faster. The bear climbed the tree so quickly that within a few seconds it was nipping at Napier's heels. Seeing the bear right behind him in the tree, Napier tried to pull his leg up to the next branch when he suddenly felt a significant resistance. Pain shot through his left calf muscle as the bear drove its teeth through it. The grizzly tugged and pulled at Napier's calf in a powerful attempt to dislodge the man from the tree. Napier's grip gave way and he slipped down the tree several inches each time the grizzly pulled on his calf. After a particularly aggressive pull, the bear's teeth tore through Napier's calf muscle and the bear slid down the tree trunk, bouncing over the limbs. As soon as it landed, the bear immediately began to climb back toward Napier. As the bear climbed back toward Napier's position, he tried to climb higher, but there wasn't anywhere further to go up the tree. The bear managed to climb higher than he did before and reached the same height as the man's thigh muscles. The grizzly bit and tugged at Napier's right thigh this time. It tore open massive gashes in his flesh as he clung to the tree for life. This situation pulled him out of his passive hope the bear would leave him alone. He began kicking the bear with his injured left leg. Napier gave the bear the boot several times before sending it toppling down the trunk of the tree once more. As soon as the bear hit the ground, it stood back to its feet and looked up at the man. The grizzly didn't know for sure what to think and demonstrated this by walking around the tree a couple of times before slowly walking off. Napier watched as the dark shape of the bear began to disappear as it got farther and farther away. He wasn't about to pile out of the tree and run into that bear again. The man waited about 30 minutes before slowly venturing down the tree. He searched the brush and bushes to see if the bear was lying in wait for him, but it wasn't. Napier wasted no time trying to get back to the road, where he hoped he would find people who may help him. Once he arrived on the road, he stumbled upon a person and relayed the story of his altercation with the bear. His newfound friend observed the injuries that plagued Napier's legs. He could see one giant gash that led into another giant gash on his left calf. He looked over his right thigh and could see several large puncture wounds that were punched deep into his muscle. His wounds were not bleeding a tremendous amount, but looked horrible. Napier was rushed to a nearby hospital, but was soon flown to Fairbanks, where he healed and completely recovered. There was nothing in the records to indicate what happened with the bear. I think it is safe to assume that the bear was left alone and was never shot by any official. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think that the bear sneaked up on Napier is proof that this attack was predatory? Why do you think a scientist would not carry a firearm into the Alaskan wilderness? How would you describe the feeling of glancing down a tree you had just climbed to see a giant grizzly bear climbing up after you? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.